The summer sun beat down on the Minnesota frontier. It was 1862. The air was thick with tension. Settlers and the Dakota people, once living in relative peace, were now on a collision course. The Dakota, also known as the Sioux, had called this land home for generations. But the arrival of European settlers brought change. It brought encroachment. It brought broken promises. The stage was set for a conflict that would leave a permanent scar on American history. The year 1862 marked a breaking point. The Dakota people were facing starvation. The promised annuity payments from the government were late. Their pleas for help fell on deaf ears. The settlers, blinded by their own hardships and prejudices, saw the Dakota as an obstacle. They failed to understand the plight of a people pushed to the brink. The Dakota people were not a monolithic group. They were divided into several bands, each with their own leaders and customs. But they shared a common language, culture, and connection to the land. Family was paramount in Dakota society. Children were raised with a deep respect for their elders and the natural world. The arrival of European settlers disrupted this harmonious existence. Trade flourished at first, but as more settlers arrived, the pressure on Dakota lands intensified. Treaties were signed, often under duress, forcing the Dakota to cede vast tracts of their ancestral territory. The buffalo, essential to the Dakota way of life, were hunted to near extinction. The government established reservations on undesirable land, far from their traditional hunting grounds. The Treaty of Traverse des Sioux in 1851 was a pivotal moment in Dakota-U.S. relations. The Dakota ceded most of their land in Minnesota to the United States. They were promised a reservation and annual payments. However, the treaty was fraught with problems. The government was slow to deliver payments. When they did arrive, they were often less than promised. Corruption was rampant among the Indian agents. The Dakota were cheated and exploited. They grew increasingly frustrated and desperate. The situation worsened in the early 1860s. The Civil War was raging in the East. The government's attention was focused on the war effort. The Dakota were forgotten. The crops failed in 1861 and 1862. The Dakota were facing starvation. They had ceded their best hunting grounds. They were confined to the reservation. They were reliant on the government for survival. By the summer of 1862, the Dakota were in a desperate situation. They had reached the breaking point. Their pleas for help had been ignored. Their children were starving. They felt they had no other choice but to fight for their survival. The simmering tensions finally boiled over on August 17, 1862. A group of young Dakota men, driven by hunger and despair, killed 5 white settlers at a farm near Acton, Minnesota. This act of violence sparked a chain reaction. The Dakota War had begun. The Dakota launched a series of attacks on settlements and military outposts throughout southern Minnesota. They were fighting for their survival. They were fighting for their land. They were fighting for their way of life. The settlers were caught off guard by the ferocity of the Dakota attacks. They fled their homes, seeking refuge in larger towns and forts. The U.S. government responded swiftly to the uprising. President Abraham Lincoln dispatched troops to Minnesota to quell the rebellion. The Dakota, outnumbered and outgunned, fought bravely. But they were no match for the U.S. Army. The war raged for 6 weeks. It left hundreds dead on both sides. One of the most infamous battles of the Dakota War took place at New Ulm, Minnesota. On August 19 and 23, 1862, Dakota warriors attacked the town, which was defended by a small force of citizen soldiers. The Battle of New Ulm was a brutal affair with heavy casualties on both sides. The town was nearly destroyed. Section 5. Defeat and Capture. A Nation Subdued. By late September 1862, the Dakota War was drawing to a close. The U.S. Army, under the command of Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley, had defeated the Dakota forces in a series of battles. The Dakota, exhausted and facing starvation, were forced to surrender. On September 26, 1862, over 2,000 Dakota people, including women, children, and the elderly, surrendered to Colonel Sibley at Camp Release, near present-day Montevideo, Minnesota. The surrender at Camp Release marked the end of the Dakota War. But it was just the beginning of a new chapter of suffering for the Dakota people. The captured Dakota were marched to Fort Snelling, near present-day St. Paul, Minnesota. They were held in a makeshift prison camp. The conditions were deplorable. Food was scarce. Disease was rampant. Many Dakota died during their imprisonment at Fort Snelling. The Dakota men were separated from their families. They were imprisoned in a fenced-in area on Pike Island, downstream from Fort Snelling. They were subjected to harsh treatment, They were put on trial for their role in the uprising. Section 6. Trials of Injustice. The Dakota People on Trial. In the aftermath of the Dakota War, there was a great deal of anger and fear among the white settlers in Minnesota. They demanded justice for the atrocities committed during the uprising. President Lincoln appointed a military commission to try the captured Dakota men for murder, rape, and other crimes. The trials were deeply flawed. The Dakota men were not afforded legal representation. They did not understand the charges against them. They were not allowed to testify in their own defense. The trials were rushed. The evidence was often flimsy or non-existent. Despite these injustices, the military commission convicted 303 Dakota men of participating in the uprising. Of these, 39 were sentenced to death. 2 men had their sentences commuted. The remaining 38 were scheduled to be hanged in the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Section 7. December 26, 1862, a day of infamy in Mankato. On a cold and blustery December 26, 1862, the largest mass execution in U.S. history took place in the small town of Mankato, Minnesota. 38 Dakota men were hanged simultaneously in front of a crowd of over 1,500 spectators. The execution was a horrific spectacle. It left an indelible stain on American history. The condemned men were marched to the gallows. They sang traditional Dakota songs, they prayed, they faced their deaths with dignity and courage. The executioner, William Dooley, struggled to carry out his grim task. The ropes were too short. Some of the men died slowly, strangling to death. The crowd watched in stunned silence. The Mankato executions were a travesty of justice. The Dakota men were denied due process. They were victims of a system that was rigged against them. The executions were a manifestation of the racism and prejudice that permeated American society at the time. Section 8. Exile. The Dakota expulsion from Minnesota. In the aftermath of the Dakota War, the Dakota people faced retribution. The Minnesota legislature passed a law that effectively banished all Dakota people from the state. They were rounded up and forced onto steamboats. They were sent to crowded and unsanitary reservations in South Dakota and Nebraska. The journey to the reservations was long and arduous. Many Dakota died along the way from disease, starvation, or exposure. Those who survived faced a bleak future. They were confined to reservations. They were denied their basic rights. They were treated as second-class citizens. The expulsion of the Dakota people from Minnesota was a tragedy. It was a stain on the state's history. It was an act of ethnic cleansing. It had a devastating impact on the Dakota people. It shattered their communities. It robbed them of their land. It stripped them of their identity. Section 9. Remembering the Past. Commemoration and Reconciliation. In recent decades, there has been a growing movement to acknowledge and commemorate the tragic events of the Dakota War and the Mankato executions. In 1992, on the 130th anniversary of the executions, a group of Dakota people and their supporters began an annual reconciliation walk from Lower Sioux Agency to Mankato. The walk is a powerful symbol of remembrance and healing. It is a way for people to come together to acknowledge the past and to work towards a more just and equitable future. In Mankato, a reconciliation park has been established near the site of the executions. It features a monument to the 38 Dakota men who were hanged. It serves as a place of reflection and remembrance. The Dakota people have shown remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. They have kept their culture and traditions alive. They have worked tirelessly to rebuild their communities. They have sought justice and reconciliation. Section 10. The Importance of Remembrance. Lessons from History. The Dakota War and the Mankato executions are a dark chapter in American history. They are a reminder of the dangers of prejudice, greed, and the abuse of power. They are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. It is essential that we remember these events. We must learn from the mistakes of the past. The Dakota War was a clash of cultures. It was a struggle for resources. It was a fight for survival. The Dakota people were the victims of broken treaties, government corruption, and settler expansion. They were pushed to the brink of starvation. They were denied their basic rights. The Mankato executions were a miscarriage of justice. They were a product of their time. They were a reflection of the racism and prejudice that was rampant in American society. We must acknowledge the injustices of the past. We must work to ensure that such atrocities never happen again. Section 11. Conclusion, a call for understanding and justice. The story of the Dakota War and the Mankato executions is a complex and tragic one. It is a story of broken promises, cultural misunderstanding, and the devastating consequences of prejudice and greed. It is a story that continues to resonate today. As we reflect on this dark chapter in American history, it is essential to approach it with sensitivity, empathy, and a commitment to understanding the perspectives of all those involved. The Dakota people suffered greatly during this period, and their experiences serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of intolerance and injustice. The story of the Dakota War and the Mankato executions is not just a historical event, it is a call to action. It is a call to remember, to learn, and to work towards a more just and equitable future for all. By acknowledging the mistakes of the past and honoring the resilience of the Dakota people, we can strive to create a society that values understanding, respects diversity, and upholds the principles of justice and human dignity for all.